Thank you so much for coming this evening. I'm really looking forward to this talk personally, and I know you'll all enjoy it. So thank you for giving up your evening. I'm Maddie. I'm the Humanist Heritage Coordinator for Humanists UK. Last year, hopefully you know, we launched the Humanist Heritage website to showcase the research that was carried out as part of the Humanist Heritage Project, which was celebrating 125 years of Humanists UK in 2021, and also exploring a much longer history of humanism, secularism and free thought in the UK. Please do check out the website if you haven't already. Or even if you have, more is being added all the time, and it will continue to be added, hopefully in perpetuity. So do have a look and a browse. But now on to this evening. I first saw Nan talk about this book at its launch through Houseman's Bookshop, which was incidentally founded by Lawrence Houseman, who's a former vice president of ours, when we were still the Ethical Union. And it was immediately very clear how relevant so much of the book was to humanist heritage, especially in our focus on uncovering the overlooked and forgotten figures within that history, many of whom, needless to say, were women. And although women's political history is often thought of as being one of largely the fight for the vote, in fact, women have been engaging with politics for far longer than that, and in incredibly diverse areas, including ones which are very central to humanism today, like freedom of thought and belief, freedom of speech and the press, and also for the removal of religious privilege. And they were given labels like scribbling trollop for doing so. So I'm really excited to hear from Nan again, especially with this particular focus on these free-thinking women from the period that's covered in the book. And I would invite you to put any questions that you have in the Q&A box, if they occur to you while Nan's talking, so that we can come back to them at the end. Nan Sloane is an author, speaker and a trainer with a particular interest in the role of women in the public sphere, especially in politics and the Labour Party. As well as Uncontrollable Women, on which this talk is, of course, based, Nan has written The Women in the Room, Labour's Forgotten History, which is also of plentiful relevance to humanist heritage and was published in 2018. And she also edited In Our Own Words, which is a compilation of quotations and political observations from hundreds of women throughout history and around the world. She's a trainer and a facilitator, working both in the UK and worldwide, delivering workshops and training courses on a huge variety of subjects, including political development and leadership skills. She's a member of the Labour Party's National Women's Committee and of the Committee of the Labour Women's Network, whose training programme she coordinates. Nan also leads the delivery of the Jo Cox Women in Leadership course, which was established to commemorate the late MP. She is a strong advocate of the need to ensure diversity of all kinds in public representatives and in the wider public realm. And so a great person to talk to us today. So thank you very much, Nan, for joining us.
Thank you very much indeed for that lovely introduction. And thank you very much for inviting me to this event this evening. It's always a great pleasure to come and talk about the women that I research and write about, but it's particularly a pleasure when there's a direct connection between their lives and the issues that people are concerned about today, and that is definitely in the case of freedom of speech, freedom of thought, and the place of religion in the public space. I'm going to focus on a small number of women during the course of this talk, but it's important to say that they were not the only women. Some of the women who were involved in radical causes a couple of hundred years ago are unnamed, so it's very difficult to research and write about them. Some of them we have almost no information about. So we have to assume that the women that we do know about are part of a much wider pool of women who contributed to the development of different ways of thinking and speaking about the society around them. Before I get to them, however, I'd just like to say a few words about the social and political environment in which people found themselves in 1815, which is roughly when this particular set of stories starts. In 1815, this country was coming out of a period of war which had lasted for nearly 20 years. It had an economy which had been impacted by the war, and as we shall see, it's about to be impacted by the end of the war. It was exhausted in many respects. It had a very small c conservative political environment, and although it wasn't a big C conservative government because there was no Conservative Party or indeed any political parties, it did have a very repressive government which spent a lot of its time being absolutely terrified of anything that looked like revolution. And because of that, being terrified of anything which looked like political dissent. It was also religiously a fairly diverse society, in that there was the established church, there was also a large community, a large dissenting community, there was also a Catholic community and various others. And everybody except Anglicans were excluded from civic participation. And this had been an issue, and a growing issue, for a very long time. There had been a lot of campaigns to extend civic rights, in particular to the dissenting Protestant communities. What there was not was a significant non-religious community, in the sense that to lack religion or not to be part of organised religion was an extraordinary thing to be or to do. Membership of the Anglican Church in particular was not just about religious affiliation, but also about civil rights and about access to civil rights. Baptism was a fundamental requirement for all kinds of things, and so that adherence to established religion didn't necessarily indicate agreement with it, but did indicate a fairly cohesive social view about the place of religion in society. And so all of the women that I am going to talk about consciously put themselves outside that, and consciously chose a course of action which they knew was going to put them at odds with the majority of the society in which they lived. This was particularly difficult for them because the position of women in 1815, and indeed for many, many decades afterwards, was almost unimaginable for us now, mainly because the legal position was so totally different from where we are now, that we find it very hard to imagine that women could possibly have submitted to it. The last vestige, perhaps, of it is the enduring fashion for women to change their names on marriage, which still happens. But that is emblematic of the situation married women found themselves in for hundreds of years, of being totally absorbed into their husband's persona as soon as they married. And most women did marry. Marriage was the norm. It wasn't very few women chose not to marry. Some did, obviously, but the vast majority of women married at some point. And at that point, they became non-people to all legal and economic intents and purposes. And there was, even amongst radicals, a very traditional view of what the relationship between women and men should be, of what a good woman was. A good woman was one who was devoted to her husband's issues, who did not express opinions of her own, who did not challenge the status quo, who accepted that her position in society was divinely ordained and therefore unalterable, and who was, above all, obedient to her husband as to her God. And as we shall see, this had for one of the women that I'm going to talk about, this had a very significant effect on her life. Nowadays, it's really hard to see why women ever accepted this. But on the other hand, if that's the environment in which you are brought up, if you are told that this is who you are, how you behave, and what your life is like from the day you are born, if every woman around you believes this, if society believes it, if the church you attend every week reinforces it all the time, if the law enforces it, if you have no economic independence because all your possessions actually belong to your husband, it is very hard to think yourself into a position of rebellion. And although a few women obviously did do that, sometimes we like to overestimate the number of women who did. It was rare, and women who did challenge the status quo found themselves on the receiving end of, well, Twitter would have had a field day with them, shall we say. There was a lot of hatred directed in their direction. So to be a woman at that time was to live a very subjugated life. And although individual couples obviously came to their own arrangements about how they were going to organise themselves and how they were going to manage their affairs, and lots of women were given a degree of economic independence or responsibility by their husbands, the bottom line was that women were part of their husbands in every respect. So, to come back to the position in 1815, when the war ended, the economy, as it often does when wars end, took a downwards turn because many of the industries which had depended upon it now found themselves in difficulties. And one of those industries was the manufacture of tin plate, which was no longer required by the army and the navy in the huge quantities it had been during the war. And that the downturn in that trade is one of the things which gives us the history of the fight for freedom of expression in the 1820s. Because in Holborn, in London, there was a tin plate worker by the name of Richard Carlisle. And he had been born in Devon, a working class family in Devon. In his early 20s, like many young men, he had tramped up to London to look for work in 1813. On the way, he had passed through Hampshire, where he had met and married Jane, who was about 7 years older than he was. He could read and write. She couldn't write. Women were often taught to read, but not so often to write. And together they got to London, set up home in Holborn. He found work fairly easily because the trade was doing well at that point. They had 3 little boys in relatively quick succession. And when the war ended, they were doing reasonably well. But when the tin plate trade collapsed, Richard found himself in all kinds of difficulties. And this turned him to thinking about how unjust society was. He had, London was a centre of radicalism, and he had been surrounded by radical discussion and ideas, and he began to get more and more involved in this, more and more interested in it, and eventually became completely committed, in particular, to the ideas that had been propounded by Thomas Paine, who was the great philosopher, revolutionary philosopher from both the American and French revolutions. And he became deeply interested in ideas about free thought and free speech. And within a fairly short space of time, had abandoned tin plate making altogether and become a radical bookseller. And he rented a shop on Fleet Street and began to sell books that were either considered very controversial or were actually banned altogether. When they moved into this shop, obviously Jane and the 3 little boys came with him, and his description of what the shop was like, and therefore what Jane found herself moving into, gives you some idea of the level of commitment that he expected from his wife. So he described the shop as in a ruinous state, not a stove, a lock, or a fixture in it, glass much shattered, staircase falling down, shop floor quite rotten. In fact, with the exception of an excellent shop front, the house was a barn, and as such, no one would live in it, but for the sake of the shop. Having possession of my new, worn-out house, I soon felt that I was got into the right sphere for action. Now, whether Jane felt she was in the right sphere for action is another matter, but we don't know because her view, of course, was never recorded by either her or anybody else. In due course, Richard was prosecuted for blasphemy, blasphemous libel, and was sentenced to a term of imprisonment and shipped off to Dorchester jail, which of course is not within visiting distance of London. One of the little boys, the youngest of the little boys, had by then died, but Jane was pregnant again. And she was left in charge of the shop. And she took it over and displayed an unexpected flair for running a business. And she managed to turn it round from a loss-making enterprise into a profit-making enterprise. And the only thing she refused to do was to sell books that had already been banned as part of Richard's trial. But everything else, she kept the same. She had the baby shortly after Richard was sent to prison, and the day after, the sheriff's officers raided the building and took everything, most of the stock, most of the furniture, including the bed she was lying in. But nevertheless, she kept going. She eventually made a significant amount of money with the shop, which of course all had to be handed over to her husband, who promptly spent it on producing a deluxe edition of the works of Tom Paine and plunged the business back into debt. Eventually, she herself was arrested and tried for the same offences of blasphemy. Tom Paine's books were considered blasphemous for a whole string of reasons and were also legally banned. And so I should say the charge of blasphemy was one which could be applied to almost anything if the authorities chose for it to be. Many of the prosecutions were brought not by the government, but by an organisation called the Society for the Suppression of Vice, known as the Vice Society, which was supported by a great many of the great and the good, including the Clapham sect, who were behind much of the anti-slave trade campaign, and in particular William Wilberforce, who was a leading light of both the fight against the slave trade and the Society for the Suppression of Vice. So Jane found herself in court. Richard Carlisle was very keen that she should defend herself, or rather that he should write a very long defence for her to read out in court, which she did. And it was evident to everybody that this was not her at all, but Richard having a second bite of his day in court, as it were. She had with her the baby, by then about 7 months old. And she was, of course, convicted. When she came back for sentencing, she did not have a pre-prepared speech that she was able just to reproduce in her voice and Carlisle's words, and said things which sound more like her, as it were. And she explained to the court that she had acted entirely from a sense of conjugal duty, without consulting my own interest or my own ideas of right and wrong. I stand before your lordships as the instrument of my husband in this publication. I know that he would as gladly bear any punishment that may fall upon me, but if this cannot be the case, I must be content to share his sufferings as I have shared his prosperity. For better or worse is the motto of the altar, and I am happy in giving my husband this instance of my regard and affection. I have already suffered all the misery that can befall a wife and mother, and I have to entreat that your lordships will not further agonize my mind by separating me from my husband and children. In other words, Jane was not in court because she believed in the cause of free speech or freedom of expression, but because she was acting in obedience to her husband, as she was expected to do, and as she expected was her duty. And in radical circles, she was very much praised for this. The Manchester Female Reform Society, for instance, wrote to her when she was in prison, because obviously she was inevitably sent there, to praise her as a model of what a radical woman should be in her obedience to her husband. And so one of the interesting things about Jane is that we can never be quite certain what she thought. She did later say that the mistreatment that she had had in prison and the experience that she had brought her to be more of a free-thinking mind than she had been before. But she is generally dismissed as not being a sufferer for the cause in the way that other people were, but a sufferer in the cause of conjugal obedience. And there is some truth in that, but it has also to be said that because she herself never left any record of what she truly thought, we can't be sure either way. And certainly, in terms of being one of the people who suffered imprisonment for the cause of free thought, she deserves a place of honour, because what happened next was definitely very unpleasant. She was sent to Dorchester jail, which of course is where Richard was. She was imprisoned in the same cell with the baby. The two older children they sent to family in Hampshire, but she had the baby with her. So there was Richard, Jane, and the baby in one cell. Richard was furiously writing, keeping his paper going, which he did, the Republican. He kept going throughout his period of imprisonment, with the exception of a few months, which was a huge achievement, and cannot have been easy with in the circumstances. Jane was soon pregnant again, and so she was locked up 23 hours a day with her husband, baby, and a difficult pregnancy. And within a matter of months, her sister-in-law, Mary Ann, Richard's sister, who took the shop over once Jane was in prison and was in turn convicted, arrested, charged, convicted, defended herself in court with speeches written by Richard. There is a story to her trial, which is in the book, which I won't go into detail of, but which was a celebrated case in its time. But off she was packed to Dorchester as well. So there was now Jane and Richard and the baby and Mary Ann, all in one cell. And we can imagine that it was not the pleasantest of experiences. The governor of Dorchester made it quite clear that his objective was to make life as unpleasant for them as possible. And so while Jane was pregnant, for instance, the water closet that they had access to was locked up at night. And Richard wrote really annoyed about and infuriated by the situation in which he found himself. He said, "Here we are, self, wife and sister locked up in one room by day, in which we have no alternative but to attend to every call of nature in the presence of each other, or by drawing a curtain across our little water closet. And at dusk in the evening, my sister is removed to a distant part of the prison after the female felons and others are locked up. And during the absence of hers from my apartment, the water closet is locked up and only unlocked when she returns." And throughout, Richard writes about the imprisonment as a penalty to him, which of course it was. But it also had consequences. Being locked up with him had consequences for Jane and Mary Ann. And Mary Ann wrote, "Were we to say that we like imprisonment, we should not speak the truth. And being incessantly locked up in the same room with Mr. Carlisle, whose affairs and duties often require a sort of silence that is not most agreeable to us, makes us feel it more than we otherwise should." In other words, Richard expected from the women with whom he was having to share his life not just support and obedience, but also silence. And predominantly, that is what we get from them. They left Jane left virtually no record of the experience. Marianne left left a scant record in mainly in letters, which were published in the Republican, or letters to individuals who had sent them gifts. Radical women regarded both Jane and Marianne as heroines of the movement and as heroines of free speech and of freedom of expression and freedom of thought. Lots of women sent Jane presents for the baby, and after Jane was released, she went on a tour of the north of England, of the radical female societies of the north of England, to thank them for their support. But she was in prison for 2 years, and came out a very different woman to when she went in, and I will come back to her in a few minutes. The third woman I want to talk about is not a member of the Carlisle family, and is an extraordinary woman called Susanna Wright. And Susanna Wright, we know, definitely did believe fully in freedom of expression, in her right to think and decide for herself on religious matters, in her right not to believe in any state religion if she chose not to, in her her right to speak publicly about that. And she took over running the bookshop when Marianne was imprisoned, and in turn was arrested and charged. But unlike Jane and Marianne, she refused to have her speeches written for her by Carlisle, and she wrote her own defence and delivered her own defence, again accompanied by a 7-month-old baby. She was from Nottingham. She was a lace worker from Nottingham. She and her husband lived in Southwark. They had got involved in radical and infidel society gradually, from Susanna's account, mainly by going to the shop and buying books from it. She had no real connection with Carlisle other than as a friend. She was probably more a friend of Marianne's than anybody else's, but she did, when Jane was tried, attend the trial to see what happened, as did a number of other women. The media, or the newspapers of the time, were absolutely outraged by the women who turned up to support other women who were being tried for blasphemy. And the editor of the New Times wrote that this is the first time that a body of women has defied all shame and trampled upon all decency in so profligate and daring a manner, in a manner at which the lowest prostitutes would shudder. It is manifest that these female brutes came prepared not only to applaud what the she-champion of impiety had already done, but to hear her load with fresh insults the law of her country and the law of her God. And that was written about the women who attended Susanna to court when she was prosecuted, but could be applied to the women who supported Jane and the women who supported Marianne just as much. And Susanna was one of those women. And she was outraged by the treatment that Jane received. And so she went straight to Marianne and said, when you are arrested, I will take over the shop, which she did. And her defence in court was a tour de force, really, of a woman prosecuted by the Attorney General in person and tried by the Lord Chief Justice in person, who stood up to both of them and to the entire weight of the court, which was ranged against her. At one point, when she was criticising lawyers, I think, the Lord Chief Justice said he could not permit her to continue to speak in such a way. And she looked him in the eye and said, "You, sir, are paid to hear me," and carried on. And for a working class woman to respond to one of the highest law officer in the land in such a way in public was extraordinary and unheard of. And she, for this reason, became notorious. She also defended her position when it came to her right to think for herself. And she said, "I have no desire either to bring the religion or the laws of this country into contempt, although I am a believer in no kind of religion whatever, nor do I like the laws under which I live. But all I wish for on the score of religion is that it be brought to the touchstone of free discussion, and that there shall be no persecution for matters of opinion." Now, Susanna Wright is one of those women who people who are interested in the history of free thought tend to have heard of, but not necessarily to have heard of in detail or to have knowledge of in detail. And this is a pity, because she should be one of the first people that people think of when they think of the long, slow development of the right to freedom of thought on religious opinion. Because for a woman to say, "I have no religion whatsoever, all I want is to be able to think freely," was astonishing for the time and profoundly shocking for people. To think that a woman could think for herself without the intervention of anybody else. Her husband never appears in any of this. It was obviously a happy marriage from other references, but he does not seem to have in any way intervened or interfered in her commitment to the cause she had got involved in. And she spoke entirely independently, entirely of her own free will. And she knew when she stood up in court and said, "I believe in no religion," that the consequences were going to be severe. And so indeed they were. And she was imprisoned first in Newgate and then in other prisons in London. Her health was very much damaged by it. She lost the sight in one eye. The baby miraculously survived, because obviously the baby was imprisoned with her. And when she came out at the end of it, she remained absolutely convinced that she was right, and that she was going to continue to promulgate what she believed in. After her husband died, she moved back to Nottingham and opened a free thought bookshop, which was then besieged by people who violently objected to it. They objected to it so violently that she kept a pair of pistols under the counter in order to protect herself for when people broke into the shop, which they did. But in the end, she won and was allowed to carry on running her shop without further trouble. And after that, she entirely disappears. There is no further record of her anywhere. And nobody quite knows what happened to her. Given that her family disappears with her, I think it likely that they may have emigrated, which a lot of radicals did. I think it very unlikely that she suddenly stopped her campaign, because she had put too much into it and had stuck to her guns through many, many difficulties. And so I think it probable that some research might turn her up in the United States or in Canada. And partly because of that, I think she has disappeared from the mainstream of history, because there is just that window of a few years into her activities. Partly because she she didn't lead a movement in the sense, say, that Carlisle did or that other people did, but she simply knew what she thought, and she thought that she had an absolute right to think it, to say it, and to persuade others of it, and she was not going to give in. And for these and many other reasons, I think she is one of the most admirable women in the history, not just of free thought, but of political development generally, and should be much more remembered than she is. Richard and Jane Carlisle, after his release, continued to live in London, but obviously there had been a considerable strain on their marriage. Richard Carlisle did the classic thing of leaving his older wife for a much younger woman. The much younger woman was Eliza Sharples, who has her own place in the history of radical free thought, speaking as Isis at the Rotunda in the late 1820s, early 1830s, in the campaign on the Great Reform Act in 1831-32, as the editor of the ISIS magazine, and as the author of letters to Queen Adelaide on the subject of parliamentary reform, all of which is covered in the book. But for Jane Carlisle, the end of the marriage was very difficult. Obviously, Eliza Sharples and Richard Carlisle could not marry because there was no divorce, and so they lived together in what was called a moral marriage, which was a not uncommon thing amongst some brands of radicalism. But in order to justify that, Richard found it necessary to attack Jane's character and to make it seem as though she had been a terrible wife, violent, disruptive, all the things, in fact, Jane had not been, because Jane's obedience had been, as we have seen, total and self-sacrificing. And so I think it is a poor return for those years and those difficulties, but also a demonstration of the extreme pressures that living lives outside the mainstream of a very narrow and repressive society could bring to bear on even very strong relationships. And that, as always on these occasions, relationships are complicated. Richard Carlisle is a major figure in the history of the development of free thought, of radical free thought, of infidelism, of non-religious political activity, although he himself did come to believe in some kind of religion by the end of his life. But the women around him are ignored. They are dealt with through his eyes. Jane is usually referred to as an aside. Mary Ann is usually his sister, who is believed to have been more committed to the cause than Jane was. Susanna Wright is usually dismissed in a few sentences. In E.P. Thompson's Making of the English Working Class, she gets about a paragraph and a half, a chunk of which is about the fact that she persuaded the Lord Chief Justice to adjourn the court so that she could feed the baby, which apparently was an exceptional thing to have done. Whereas I think that the exceptional thing that all of those women did was to pick up a cause that was unusual for the time, that was very much outside the mainstream of society and of what was expected of women, and to take risks that landed all of them in trouble of one kind or another. They believed in different things. I'm not sure that Susanna Wright took the same view of marriage that Jane Carlisle did, but they all suffered ultimately for the same cause, which was, as Susanna said, the bringing of religion into the light of free discussion. And that ability to do that has been a long fight, which still has not been won, although we are obviously closer to it than we were 200 years ago, and which I am sure if Susanna in particular were around today, she would be throwing herself into with enthusiasm. There are in the book many other women, some of them free thinkers, some of them not, all of them working against the norms of their day in one way or another. But these three women in particular, Jane and Mary Ann Carlisle and Susanna Wright, I think are some of the bravest and most courageous women that I have ever researched. And I think they are deserving, all of them in their different ways, of a better commemoration than they have. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was great. And I am completely in agreement, needless to say, about Susanna Wright and Jane and Mary Ann Carlisle, definitely. And as you say, Eliza Sharples definitely earned her place in the radical free thought history for her faults, which I think is something that really interested me, especially in reading the book, and I think you deal with really well, which is that idea that essentially history is very complicated, and people that we might admire for certain things we don't necessarily like very much, or we can, acknowledge their faults at the same time as we as you say, admire them or can recognize the successes or the causes they fought for being admirable, which I thought was a really interesting thing. And also, and this came up in a talk I went to the other day about who we give plaques to and who we commemorate. And I think there's something quite potentially complex with women in particular, perhaps. Somebody asked the question whether we only, whether we commemorate all men, but only good women. And that's quite an interesting thing, I think, when it comes to, these baddest of the bad atheist or free-thinking women who seem to be kind of throwing away all that was good about womanhood and femininity, which is, I guess, not so much a question, but I would be interested to know your kind of thoughts on that.
Well, yes, I entirely agree. I think that we hold now, then as now, we tend to hold women to a higher standard and hold women in the public space to a higher standard. I think there are some really obvious places where Jane and Mary Ann Carlisle could be commemorated. We're talking about blue plaques. The bookshop was 55 Fleet Street. I don't know if there is a plaque to Richard Carlisle there, but there should certainly be one to all of them, to the whole family, and to the long succession of working class women and men who subsequently staffed the shop and got sent to prison in their turn, about 35 of them. And people travelled from all over the country in order to undertake this task, knowing perfectly well that they were going to end up in some hideous jail or other somewhere. And there should be on the site of that, obviously that shop is no longer there, but there should be something on that site. Susanna and her husband, William, lived in Tower Street in Southwark, which was on the site of what is now City Hall. And so there should be a plaque on City Hall that says, "Here lived Susanna Wright, free thinker," whatever wording you chose. And there's no, many of these women have no commemoration at all. One of the problems is that we are obsessed with the suffrage campaign, and we see the history of women through that prism. And so if women weren't arguing for the vote, or weren't arguing for so the precursors of the vote, we tend to be much less interested in them. So we think the history of women as political activists starts in the 1860s when the suffrage campaign started. And in fact, this is nonsensical. And the book is full of women who were being political. And you can go back as far as, women in the Civil War, in the 17th century, intensely political. And you can go back as far as you like. Of course, women were interested in what was happening around them. Of course, women were interested in who had power and how. They just didn't interpret it in the way that we do. So patriarchy would not have meant anything to them because they didn't see themselves. In fact, women saw themselves as living in one of the freest societies in the world for women, and thought that Britain was one of the best places in the world to be a woman, and looked at some of the societies around them and were appalled by the way in which they thought women were treated, and did not see that the treatment that they had was as restrictive and repressive in different ways. And because they don't see this, we tend not to think of them as part of women's political history in the way that we do even very early suffrage campaigners. And we lose out from that because we restrict women to having a political interest only in the position of women. Whereas, in fact, women have always been interested in everything and active in everything, but also marginalised in everything, either by the society of their times or by our distorted view of women's political past. So, yes, I think that we should be thinking about women of whom we can get commemorations. I saw somebody in the Q&A saying a statue of Susanna Wright in Parliament Square. Absolutely, because she represents a completely different strain of women's activism from Millicent Fawcett. And I am a great admirer of Millicent Fawcett, but I'm a great admirer also of Susanna Wright. And I don't see how obviously Millicent Fawcett was not a militant suffrage campaigner, but what Susanna Wright went through in Newgate, and I think it's King's Bench prison, Coldbath Fields prison, in the early 1820s, is as bad as anything that happened to suffragettes nearly 100 years later, and is as worthy of commemoration.
I think that's something that really comes out in the book amazingly well, that as you say, that really important involvement of women in arenas that weren't just about women's rights, and whose views wouldn't be considered feminist by any stretch of the imagination in our modern sense, which risks them then being kind of discarded as quaint or kind of, I suppose, not worthy of that commemoration. But that's the case with everyone, isn't it? Is that there's all these complex nuances to even the people we admire and can recognize as that. So I think that's a really important part of it. And the other thing I was thinking as well is that even some of those people, and I suppose this is what we looked at quite a lot with the Humanist Heritage Project, or what we wanted to do, was that actually lots of particularly women who were active politically, including in the suffrage campaigns, were free thinkers. They were humanists to all intents and purposes. But again, because that still sits somehow slightly outside of what we're comfortable with acknowledging, that more kind of nuanced side of their beliefs and their motivations doesn't necessarily come out in our biographies of them, or in the way that we tell their stories or laud their achievements. So again, it's just very complicated.
It is complicated. We're very selective about what we choose to elevate. And what was elevated at the time about Jane Carlisle, her absolute obedience to her husband, is something now which we find faintly repellent, if we're honest. I mean, we would think that as a weird way to behave, and if we met her, our instinct would be to, try and talk her out of it, and we would get very impatient and find her very irritating, and she's almost, she often reminds me in some ways of the sorts of women that Dickens felt were laudable. They're, obscured by their men, very subservient, but because it was in a cause that people found also repellent, she sort of the thing that you would think that her Times would praise her for is obscured by the fact that she was doing it for a man who was regarded as treasonable and wicked and should be locked up for as long as possible, which he was, and so she loses either way. She doesn't fit our view of what a woman should be and how a modern woman should behave, and she didn't fit their view either, because her obedience was to a man who was regarded as evil by mainstream society. And so rescuing some of those women and saying, despite the fact that I think your obedience is ludicrous, and you still are entitled to some respect for where it took you, because, once she did manage to get some money out of him when they separated, and set her own bookshop up just round the corner from him, which he took considerable exception to. But she was a person in her own right. She took her own decisions. She could have decided to do something different, and she didn't. She decided to do what she did, and she should be respected for that.
I don't think that's the thing, isn't it, as well? I mean, with Jane Carlisle, that was the awful thing. She's kind of, her achievements and the causes that she stood for are belittled when they're seen only in relation to Richard Carlisle, because, she was just doing her wifely obedience. But then when she does split from Richard Carlisle and she establishes her own bookshop, she's painted as this completely, evil, awful woman,
exactly,
and still somehow doesn't get the recognition for, as you say, being her own person, being a person in her own right, establishing this bookshop, whether out of spite or just because she was still continuing the cause. We've got some good questions that have come in, and as I say to everybody, please do keep sending them. So one from Laura McClellan. do you think these women expected to see change within their lifetimes, or did they think change would happen at all? Do we these days expect immediate responses, which they would not have ever expected at all?
I think it very unlikely that they thought they would see change come quickly. If only because all of the other changes that people were campaigning for were coming very slowly. So if you look at the abolition of the slave trade took decades, the abolition of slavery took decades. There were campaigns around all kinds of issues. At the time, parliamentary reform was taking decades to achieve, and was not finished by what is known as the Great Reform Act, which was neither great nor particularly reforming. So I think people knew that change was very slow. And I think also in the case of religion, just the sheer weight of religious belief and of religious, the interweaving of religion with day-to-day life, the vestiges of which are still with us. I think it very unlikely that anybody, even Carlisle, could have thought that suddenly it was going to change overnight and that people's opinions were going to change. But I think that Susanna Wright in particular, I think, did think that unless you started somewhere, you were never going to get anywhere. And that therefore doing her little bit for it would make a difference. And that difference might make a difference in the future. I think the overlap is with elements of the reform movement and the parliamentary reform movement, and I think that was so slow and so difficult that it's very unlikely that anybody seriously believed that change was going to be quick. I think now we have a very different expectation of how society moves. We're better at the surface dressing nowadays. I think that we, it's a bit like my view of equal opportunities training. You do the training, you tick the box, you assume everybody's changed their mind. And of course, they haven't. You may have planted a seed for people to think about, but you change people's view of society and how it works much more slowly than that. And I do think that we tend to look all the time for the quick fix. And for matters of opinion and belief, the quick fix is not there. It's a long, slow haul in which each generation does its bit.
Great, thank you. Just again, maybe not picking up on the main strand of that, but it was something I was thinking about also, particularly as our previous talk was by S.I. Martin about the beliefs of Black Georgians. And it was interesting to think about the parallels in kind of excavating the real beliefs of people, particularly when it came to religion, given how embedded the church was, as you say, not just in people's, religious observances, but also in their civic rights and the things that they were able to do or able to access or not. And I think that's really interesting. And I guess the history of free thinking and of kind of humanist ideas in general is that it really does make it hard to know, because as you mentioned in the book, the baptizing your children was kind of necessary in many ways to access lots of things, which is similar to what S.I. Martin said about the long 18th century, is that again, to access things like support for if you fell into poverty or even social respectability, being baptized in that case for adults was central to that. So it makes it difficult
Absolutely.
for us to see, what do these people really believe? I think you used a really interesting Oh yeah, you said adherence didn't necessarily indicate agreement, which I thought was very pithy way of summing that up.
Well, Jane had all the children baptized. She did it when Richard was away at various points, and she did it in a church away from where they lived. But she had them all baptized for exactly that reason, that if they fell on hard times, they wouldn't be able to access support unless they could produce baptismal certificates, access to almost anything. And this is why there was such a long campaign to repeal the Test and Corporations Acts, which prevented dissenters. Independent members of independent churches or Baptist churches or whatever could not participate in public life of any kind because they would not attend church. And that included access to universities, access to certain professions. There is a reason why there are so many Quaker families who founded businesses, some of which still in existence today. It's because they couldn't, that was what there was for them to do, teaching or business. And so that is what they did. And I think the point that it was so interconnected with civic life is really relevant, and that it's really hard to find what people really did think, because they obviously weren't going to say so. People accepted the norm, which is what most of us do for most of the time.
There is a couple of questions which pick up on the idea, I suppose, of the particular environments that working women and the working classes would have been in, which may have encouraged, radical thought or helped it to circulate. So Sally says, do you think them being working women or in an environment where there were radical workers, did that make them more likely to think freely? And similarly, Hannah Hill asks, do you feel that these women's specific social niche actually encouraged this bravery and boldness in their political endeavours, and that perhaps richer women would have been happier with the status quo?
I actually think that almost the converse is true. It took far more courage, I think, for working class women to stand up for what they believed in, because they had so much more to lose. If they were dependent on what they could earn in order to eat, then they could not put themselves in any position where they might be unemployable. This is when people say, there were very few, we must find all the working class women who are in the suffragette movement. And, I can say, well, there weren't very many, because if you were a working class woman and you went to prison and you had a criminal record, you were unemployable. And so you're risking far more than the middle class woman who would go home to her servants and her nice house. You could end up literally on the streets. And the same is true now, that they were risking really everything that they had, whereas some of the middle class women in the book certainly risked reputation and risked a lot of time being attacked and called names and so on and so forth, but they didn't have to worry about where the next meal was going to come from. They didn't worry about how to keep the children fed. They weren't, there are accounts in the section about Peterloo and the female reform societies about the absolute destitution some of these women face on occasions, and still. There is one woman called Charlotte Johnston whose husband was imprisoned when habeas corpus was suspended in 1817. And she wrote to him on the one hand saying, I've got no shoes, I've got no food to give the children, I don't know how we're going to survive. And then a couple of years later, she wrote to him saying, you'll have seen that the women are now going to do something and are forming female reform societies, and we're bound to be successful because one woman can do more than 5 men. And so I think the risk for working class women was huge. The penalty for stepping out of line was huge. And so I think their courage is all the greater because they knew what might happen and they took the risk anyway. Whereas middle-class women ran different risks. They could be socially ostracized, this could happen, but they were not going to find themselves in the kind of destitution that working-class women could.
And a second part to Hannah's question. Do you envisage a time when these women become canon in historical/political studies alongside Wilberforce, etc.? Wilberforce is such an interesting character, isn't he? With the Society of for the Suppression of Vice could be its whole own talk. But do you envisage such a time? Dare we hope for such a time?
Well, only if we keep banging on about it. Which, there is greater academic interest, I think, in some of these women now, but it needs to break out of that into a more mainstream knowledge about them. And I think, I despair about history taught in schools for a long list of reasons that I'm sure many other people would share. So I don't think that's the route at the moment by which we're going to celebrate anybody who was a rule breaker rather than. But I do think that if people become interested in these women, research these women, write theses on these women, do television programs on these women, that gradually we will get there. But again, I think it will be slow because people have particularly in England, I think, a very narrow idea of what their history is and are very resistant to it being anything other than that. And I think our idea of this period is very distorted by all kinds of things, but in particular by the sort of what you might call the Jane Austen view of history, that it's all bonnets and nice gowns, and I have a lot of time for Jane Austen. I think she's a mildly revolutionary in her own way and had a way of saying things that she could get away with. And I think she's also much misjudged on some levels. But I also think that that's the history that people want to think about. They don't particularly want to think about all the other things that were going on at the time. Not just the big shocking events like Peterloo, but just the day-to-day course of the Industrial Revolution, the massive social and economic change that brought about, the huge internal migrations that there were, particularly in the north of England, the revolution in how rural communities lived, and the stripping out of rural communities and the development of towns is all sort of glossed over. And so we lose all that side of our history. And what we have is the idea of, I don't know, Jane Austen, Bridgerton, that sort of a layer of society. And that's true in a lot of periods, but I think it is particularly true of this. It's almost as though we were so traumatized by 20 years of war and revolution that we've just parked it all and thought we won't think about that because it's quite difficult and unpleasant.
Yep.
It is.
Yeah, well, it is. Yeah, absolutely. But as you say, I think and that's again what the book does so well is look at some of some of those examples that we do have of where these women were doing quite revolutionary and writing quite startlingly revolutionary, and also startlingly is prescient the right word? Something that we can often still resonates now, even when things have changed so much. There's another question here from Kate. Did political society at the time feel more threatened by women as they grew older, particularly if they at some point stopped being reliant on men? I was just reminded of, or this reminds me of the quote you mentioned in the book about Anna Letitia Barbauld being called an old snake by Wordsworth, which shocked me. But again, another amazing dissenter in the book, yes, writing about writing about everything, and but being particularly vilified once that strayed more into politics than into the kind of safer areas of education and childcare and children's stories and things like that. But yeah, did political society at the time feel threatened by women as they grew older, or I suppose any woman that was in some way less reliant on men potentially?
Yes and no. I think Anna Letitia Barbauld is a really interesting woman because she had a whole life as an educator and a writer of children's stories and a poet, and then in middle age suddenly erupted into this massively political phase of her life and wrote about a whole string of things, some of it in recognizable terms, sounds very modern when you read it. And she wrote about discrimination, she wrote about war, she wrote about power, she wrote about all kinds of things that women were not particularly supposed to write about. And that's when she incurred, Wordsworth had admired her when she was writing poetry and children's books, and as you say, later referred to her as that old snake Barbauld. And I think there is something about women being older, but I think in this context it's more about women being political, because politics was so absolutely not women's business. And so when she was inveighing against war, for instance, and really takes apart the whole concept of why countries make war and how they make war, and of the way in which they consciously prepare for war and pretend it's something else. And has got some really striking passages about how military estimates should be put together, and should be more in terms of how many people has this money killed, rather than the things that it does do. And it's worth reading, if only because there is something very modern about it. But it's when she did that people became worried about her, and after her death, they simply parked all of her political work, because people remembered her children's books and had a fondness for her children's books and had them in their own nurseries. They simply remembered her as a children's writer and just stripped out all the politics from her story. And I think that tends to be more the case of what they did. It was that they could not stand political women of any kind, unless they were standing behind their husbands, supporting them. And even then, they should do it discreetly in the background, preferably at home, hosting dinners for their politician husbands and so on, and not in any way involved in any public kind of life. William Wilberforce was even opposed to women collecting signatures for anti-slavery petitions, because he thought it was wrong for women to be going door to door talking to strangers, asking them to engage in a political activity. And so I think it's more that than age. The other thing is, of course, there were fewer older women around because the attrition rate for women in childbirth was so high.
And so in Wollstonecraft's example.
yeah, exactly. But huge numbers of others, and so older women weren't rare, but they were less. There were fewer of them, and more likely to be conformist, but not entirely, as we know.
So there's a few remaining ones. So Steve Roman mentions firstly that a group of them in Manchester are working on a long-term campaign to commemorate important women who lost out in the competition that led to the erection of the Emmeline Pankhurst statue.
Yes.
which is great. Interesting to note though that Emmeline Pankhurst was an atheist, and her and Richard Pankhurst was very much part of humanist heritage, certainly argued for secularism, and of course the wonderful Sylvia Pankhurst was also a great humanist. So but that's really great to know. And I think as well, I'm right in saying that there is the group in Nottingham Humanist Group are looking to commemorate Susanna Wright in some way.
Good.
In Nottingham, which would again be excellent. And one final one, because we're getting on now, getting towards a half past. But there is this question from Marion Dorrington about why it's taken so long to change the requirement for partners to rubbish each other to get a divorce. And I think that divorce, I mean, that's I'm sure a long answer in itself. So maybe not the best one to pick to end on.
Well, I'm sure partners will still rubbish each other. It's just that they don't need to do it in order to get a divorce. And neither did Richard Carlisle need to do it in order to get a divorce, because the only way he could have got a divorce was by paying thousands of pounds to get an Act of Parliament through, and that was never going to happen. So he didn't need to do any of that. He did it in order to justify what he knew to be, not a very nice thing to be doing, and therefore, if he could feel when you read Richard Carlisle, and he was not a man who was lacking in ego or in either self-interest or not aggrandizement. I don't mean that, but I mean he had a very clear sense of his own importance, and the idea of him being at fault is not something that sits well with him, and he knew he was doing something that Jane did not deserve, and so he justified it by trashing her reputation. And unfortunately, people like friends of his like George Holyoake, who obviously is a major figure in the secular movement, agreed with him, because I'm sorry to say, but men tend to back each other up on these things. And so it gets repeated through reputable sources, and we end up with this narrative that Jane was a terrible wife who, and there was no need for him to do that. He could simply have made sure she was all right and moved on, if that's what he wanted to do. And the trashing of her is just an unpleasant layer. I think couples will still do that. I think it is a huge advance that they no longer need to do that through the courts.
And I suppose as well, there's that repetition by other men, but also unfortunately, and this comes out in the book too, by other women. So
yes,
Carlisle's daughter by Eliza Sharples kind of rolled out some of those same stories about Jane in her biography of him. And I suppose so much of that, again, it's that need to portray as much respectability as possible, and especially in something like divorce, still then very bound up with kind of religiously influenced concepts of the good family and the the good wife, and indeed the fabric of society itself. It is difficult, and I'm sure was for Theophila Campbell as well, to provide much nuance.
Yeah, and she was writing in the 1890s herself, in her 60s, I think, and living by then in California, and nobody was going to contradict her. Who was there left who could say, actually, that's not how this goes? Because by that stage, the children of Jane and Richard Carlisle were all dead. We don't know about their descendants, but they certainly won't have been in touch with Eliza's descendants. And so she had a clear field, really, to say whatever she believed to be the truth. And that is probably what Eliza told her, but that doesn't make it true, and certainly doesn't square with anything that Richard himself said at the time, or with what we can see of Jane's behaviour. So it's a sad, I think, end to the story, but also demonstrates that these things are complex, and that even the people we admire and who are critical to significant movements of one kind or another are not necessarily the most likable people in the world.
It's also very human, isn't it?
Yes, exactly.
That's it.
Exactly. We're complex. We don't fit into easy molds, do we?
Exactly. Okay, well, we've got 1 minute before the past bell tolls, by my reckoning anyway. So thank you so much again, Nan, for talking to us, and thanks everyone for your questions, and again for your time, and for sticking out to the end. Also, check out Nan's brilliant book, Uncontrollable Women. Here it is. And likewise, please check out Humanist Heritage, and in general, thank you again, everyone. It's been a great evening, and lovely. Thanks very much.